Good afternoon. My name is Mark Zuckerman, president of the Century Foundation. I'm so glad that you've joined us today. TCF is one of the nation's first public policy think tanks. We opened shop 103 years ago, and we've never stopped working to improve people's lives through research and progressive policy solutions. To save time, we've put some additional information about TCF in the chat page. Today, we have a remarkable panel of experts to unwind last night's State of the Union speech by President Biden. I want to take a moment just to set up the discussion with a little background. I was President Obama's deputy domestic policy advisor for a couple of years, so I've seen up close how a White House thinks about a big speech like this. State of the Union addresses are high-stake events because they have historically attracted 30 to 60 million viewers, a rare opportunity for a president to communicate in depth with an audience. There's also a captive audience in Congress, which is a unique opportunity to make the president's case for legislation. And the speech, of course, draws significant international audience, especially in time of war, that can help shape our nation's image and influence abroad. When I think about the goals that President Biden had going into this speech, I think of three main things. One is to rally the world to stand up for democracy against Russian aggression. He had to demonstrate strength and resolve by committing to provide economic and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. He had a moral case to make in light of Russia's unprovoked attack and the need to set the historic record straight, given Russia's misinformation campaign. The second basket of things that the president had as goals is he wanted to frankly brag about some accomplishments during his administration while showing empathy for many who are still struggling. The economy has rebounded, creating over 6 million new jobs. The economy's grown at a rate of 5.7%, and unemployment has dropped to under 4%. COVID cases are in deep decline, and tens of millions have been fully vaccinated. The president also had a significant brag about his legislative accomplishments, which included almost $2 trillion in spending in response to COVID and some $1.2 trillion in new infrastructure spending. And of course, he kept his promise to nominate the nation's first Black woman to the US Supreme Court, naming Judge Jackson to the Supreme Court, nominating her. The third and final goal President Biden was attempting to accomplish during his speech was to reset his strategy, especially his legislative strategy. One of the things that he did is recast his agenda in terms of fighting inflation. And he named lowering the cost of childcare, housing, and transportation as priorities for him in terms of lowering the cost in light of inflation. He also proposed to increase the minimum wage, reform labor laws, and to boost high-paying jobs through investing in innovation and manufacturing. He also wanted to reset by emphasizing some bipartisan issues that he thought he could get bipartisan support on with respect to veterans, mental health, cancer, the opioid crisis, and strategies to make the nation more competitive. So let me turn to our panelists for their view of how the president did. But first, let me give you a brief introduction of this great panel. Thanasi Cabanas, TCF Fellow and Director of Century International. Stephen Greenhouse, TCF Fellow for Economics and former New York Times reporter for over 30 years. Julie Cashin, Director of the Women's Economic Justice and Senior Fellow at TCF and former policy advisor to the late Senator Edward Kennedy. Andy Stettner, TCF Fellow and one of the nation's leading expert on unemployment insurance and manufacturing. Dr. Jamila Taylor, the Director of Healthcare Reform and Senior Fellow and former Director of Women's Health and Rights at the Center for American Progress. Emma Videra, TCF Fellow for Education and also 100 executive director. She was the former chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Education during the Obama administration. And then Danny Weiss, director of governmental affairs and senior fellow, and he was the former chief of staff of the speaker for Speaker Nancy Pelosi. So panel, I want to do a couple speed rounds with you to get your reaction from last night's speech. In a sentence, 2 if you have to, tell me what you thought about last night's speech. Thanasi.
The president wanted to tell Americans that we were going to stand united and no longer treat foreign policy and international war as a bipartisan issue to divide Republicans and Democrats.
Stephen.
Sorry, I thought it was one of the very best State of the Union addresses I've heard in 2, 3, 4 decades. He really sought to reset his presidency, and I think he did a good job. He really inspired Americans to rally around backing Ukraine, and he really sought to reach out to blue-collar Americans, and I think he did a very strong job on that.
Julie.
I think it was a speech that spoke to everyone, and especially for the women who have been struggling with work and care and job loss and the loss of loved ones over these last 2 years. They clearly saw themselves reflected in this speech when he talked about the need for childcare, for pre-K, for home care, for paid leave, for equal pay. And so it spoke to everyone, and it had special messages for women.
Andy.
I'm going to borrow from Senator Sherrod Brown, who commented the speech that we heard from President Biden, the most pro-worker president in our lifetime, reaffirm his commitment to put workers at the center of our economy. Democrats who are worried about the declining support among working class voters should really listen to the president and really echo this message.
Jamila.
I thought the speech was good. Was really encouraged by the fact that President Biden was clear about his domestic agenda, stood strong on all of the things that he's been advocating for in terms of the American people. I will say that in terms of the healthcare pieces, I wanted to hear a little bit more when it comes to access to abortion and maternal health care, but we'll get to that more later in the conversation.
Emma, your headline.
I will copy Jamila. I thought it was, and Steve, I thought it was a really strong speech. I thought there was a lot in there. I left, as I think many did, feeling reinvigorated about the president's domestic agenda and our strength and compassion internationally. From an education perspective, I think there were a couple of good headlines and down payments, but I also left wanting to hear more about how we're going to support our students going forward. Danny.
I agree with Stephen. It was one of the best State of the Union speeches I remember in a long time. It was excellently delivered by a president who is known to have a stutter, and he was flawless, virtually flawless in his delivery. And that's really one of the most important things about these speeches, is to convey a sense of confidence and strength and believability. And I believe that the things that he talked about are things that he actually knows about, and that really came through. I would also say, which touches on what Emma and Julie and Jamila have said, is that he kind of threw the kitchen sink at the American people and at Congress. And to me, that was essentially saying, this is who I am. These are the things I believe in. I don't necessarily believe we're going to do all these things, but I want you to know who I am. And I think he did a very good job at doing that.
Thank you, panel. So let me throw one more lightning round question at you. If you had to pick out of the speech a sentence or 2 that you thought was notable, or a theme that you thought was notable to set up our later discussion, what would it be? Let's go back to Thanasi.
So I would say he summed up his whole international section, which was a fifth of the speech, in 2 sentences. He said, or 2 phrases. He said, American diplomacy matters, American resolve matters. And then he said later, this is a real test. It's going to take time.
Stephen.
I believe Biden has been the most pro-union president in decades, perhaps even the most pro-union president in history. So it's not surprising he said, let's pass the PRO Act, the big pro-union legislation that's been blocked by a Republican filibuster. But then he said, when a majority of workers want to form a union, they shouldn't be stopped. And that's a very powerful line. It's kind of saying, look, employers, if more than 50% of your workers say they want to form a union in the first instance, just get out of the way, let them do it, and perhaps you shouldn't be able legally to block it. So that's a pretty far-reaching pro-union statement.
Julie.
The president said last night that his plan will cut costs in half for most families and help parents, including millions of women who left the workforce during the pandemic because they couldn't afford childcare, to be able to get back to work. And it doesn't stop there. It includes home and long-term care, more affordable housing, and pre-K for every 3 and 4-year-olds. He really set the stage for his economic agenda to lead with these measures that are going to cut inflation and that are going to help us build the care infrastructure and the care economy that Americans have needed for so long.
Andy.
The president said, when we use taxpayers' dollars to rebuild America, we're going to do it by buying American, buy American products, and support American jobs. And it was such a personal and heartfelt message that it inspired a kind of spontaneous patriotic cheer from bipartisan members of Congress. And as he's seeking another bipartisan win in the few months before the midterms, he called on Congress to act on an overlooked $200 billion manufacturing and competitiveness package that passed the Senate last year by a 68-32 margin.
Jamila.
I think in addition to some of the healthcare pieces that the president outlined, I really love the fact that he talked about Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson and described her as one of the best legal minds in this country. And as the first Black woman to be nominated to the Supreme Court, I think is such a pivotal moment in this country. And that's something that really resonated with me.
Emma.
President said, our schools are open. Let's keep it that way. Our kids need to be in school. And after the past couple of years, I think that was a message deeply needed and deeply heard by students, by working moms, and by families across the country.
Danny.
So I'm going to be a little bit of a skunk at the picnic and say that one of the lines that stood out the most for me was when he said, don't defund the police, fund the police. And the reason that that line stood out for me is because the State of the Union speech, especially in a campaign year, is notoriously a signal for what the president's party should be saying and talking about when they run for office. And obviously that message, which does not reflect the vast majority of the Democratic Party of defunding the police, has been used by opponents of Democrats as a claim that that is what they're for. And of course, there are some people who are for that and many others who are not. So I thought he was signaling to the party that that's an important message for the fall elections.
All right, thanks, panel. Let's get into this a little bit. Thanasi, I'm going to start with you. And to set this question up, I won't use the word swagger because I don't think that's it, but confidence in talking about Ukraine, because the president, was leading the European Union and NATO to give such a strong response to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So he's very confident in the words that he was using and strong in his messaging. What was your take?
This is a president who knows foreign policy, he knows the international space, and he knows Vladimir Putin. Of course, no one was expecting Putin to go this far. On the other hand, since he took office, he's been working to deter Russia and Russian aggression. So none of this is coming in a vacuum. It's not a foreign policy crisis for which the administration was unprepared. I think he had 3 really major themes in mind as he spoke. One was he was speaking to the world, not just Ukrainians and Russians, but the whole world. And he was saying, we will defend NATO territory. We will deter an aggressive dictator, because if you don't stop them, they keep rolling. He used this phrase. There's a sort of echo of Munich. There's an awareness that at some point, these faraway aggressors become problems for us. The second thing that he was, I think, really hammering on very effectively is alliances, international partners. During the Trump years, especially, America doubted whether NATO had any value. There was a lot of contempt for alliances and partnerships and treaties and international rule of law. And these are things that not just Democrats, many Americans hold dear. And he was saying, these are, we've been working on these. We were working on them before the crisis in the Ukraine, and we're working on them even harder now. We've been effective at unifying Europe. And I think he was inviting American politicians who have really irresponsibly turned security issues into partisan football to say, hey, deterring Vladimir Putin is not a Republican or Democratic issue. It is an American security, it is an international security issue. The last thing I think he did very deftly, and this is tough, is take a nod to the hit that this conflict is going to inflict on people in the United States, on the pocketbook of workers and consumers. Energy supplies will be disrupted. He's very warm in talking about the human cost of things. So just the way he spoke about Ukrainians and Ukrainian civilians who are facing so bravely facing this aggression, he also spoke with a lot of empathy about Americans who are going to have some kind of disruption and maybe some kind of trouble heating their homes or filling their gas tanks or paying for things as a result of disruptions caused by this conflict. And he said, he said, we're going to be all right. But he also said, I think in a careful but direct way, this is going to be hard. This is a real test. It's going to take time. This is not going to be cost-free. These are not the wars of 9/11 where George W. Bush said, please go shopping. Don't let this worry you and disrupt your life. This is going to affect our lives, and it's important, and it's worth it. And that's why he took so much time to build that narrative, starting with the people in the Ukraine who are paying this price, personified by the Ukrainian ambassador up in the gallery who got a hug from Jill Biden, all the way back, looped in just a few minutes to Americans filling their gas tanks. And I think that is the correct way to talk about this high risk, high stakes, but also very important set of core American interests.
Nasi, let me ask you about the Congress's reaction. It seemed, at least on TV, to be truly a bipartisan positive response to the things that he was saying. Although we know the right wing, some in the right wing have cozied up to Putin and have a different view about Russia than I think a lot of people do. Were you surprised how bipartisan the response to Ukraine was?
I'm not surprised, but I'm cautious in making too much of it. I mean, we heard just a few days ago former President Trump describing Putin as a genius for his moves. We know there is deep support for Russia and for Russian authoritarianism among Republicans. I mean, it's very unfortunately clear sort of partisan hue to the polling. So what is heartening and maybe a little surprising is that the politics and optics are such that nobody wants to be seen applauding this terrible war of aggression. And that's why even the Republican response led with agreeing with portraying the heroism of the Ukrainians. But there is a gap in interest here, and I think we're going to see maybe a corrective in Congress over this. But it's by no means a foregone conclusion that Americans on a bipartisan basis will unite in favor of Ukraine and against Russian aggression. I do think, just really quickly to your question, this is a clarifying moment. I mean, we've had a lot of NATO skepticism among some Americans, mostly Republicans, but also some isolationists across the board. And I think they're going to have to come out and say, do we really think it's worth abandoning democracy and rights and security in Europe and throughout the core of the international system on which we depend? Are we willing to let this happen and let, say, down the road, Taiwan get invaded? And I think that is going to be a clarifying moment for isolationists and all these soft sympathizers with dictators around the world and with Russia.
Right, Thanasi, thank you so much. We may bring you back into this discussion in a few minutes. So let me jump over to Stephen, Julie, and Andy. You all look at the speech from different sort of economic perspectives. And Julie, I noted that the president clearly talked about issues like childcare in the context of costs and how the administration can reduce costs given the increase in inflation. I think it's a pivot. It seems like a pivot from the Build Back Better to better calibrate that proposal to what many Americans are concerned about, which is growing inflation. Will this work? And did you think he did it well?
I thought he did do it well. I think that we're still talking about the same policies that were part of the Build Back Better package. And that's really about the fact that the United States has never built a comprehensive childcare and early learning system, that we've only put together kind of some targeted programs. And 50 years ago, President Nixon vetoed bipartisan childcare legislation. And so we are closer than we've been in 50 years to being able to pass something this comprehensive. So what the policy will do, it will help parents get back to work. It will build a sustainable early care and education workforce because it'll make those jobs good jobs. It'll help children yield the lifelong benefits of high quality early care and education. And it will lower costs for families. So it actually is a win for all. It does all of those different things. But childcare is an area where prices are rising faster than inflation and have long been doing that. And so making childcare affordable by putting in public dollars to the system to make sure that both families can afford it and early educators can make at least a living wage, I think is hugely important and has to remain the economic priority that the president made it last night.
And I noted that he also mentioned parental leave, and of course, early childhood education has been a priority. If you think about support for families, when you put childcare with early childhood education and parental leave, those three things together are some of the strongest, pro-family proposals that we've seen from any president for some time. And I know you spent a lot of years working on all three of them.
That's absolutely right. We need paid family and medical leave, that helps parents to care for their newborn children, for newly adopted children, that also allows spouses to care for a seriously ill loved one, or, for grown-ups to care for their aging parents. So it's incredibly important. We have family and medical leave in place, which is an unpaid policy that protects jobs for those people who qualify. But right now, we know every single one of us is going to have care responsibilities at some point in our lives. And so to not acknowledge that, to not have workplace policies that say we need to both be able to care for our loved ones and earn a decent wage and provide for our loved ones, that's a really big problem. And we are very much alone in the world in this. We are one of very few countries that doesn't have paid family and medical leave in place. And so the fact that the president prioritized this, he has so many of his own stories about caring for his loved ones. And I think he really understands how you need to be able to, be there for them. He's somebody who commuted 4 hours to be back and forth with his children. So I think he understands how work and family are both priorities, and everyone should be able to make them the priorities that they want to.
Thank you, Steve. You mentioned that the president spoke about the PRO Act and about minimum wage, helping workers. Those are hard legislative goals to accomplish in this Congress. Isn't it true, though, and you've written so much about this, that workers aren't only waiting around for Washington to do something, that all across the country, workers are taking this issue about their own security, wages, into their own hands. Can you tell us a little bit about your sense of what's happening around the country with workers, whether it's Starbucks or local establishments or larger corporations, that workers are starting to rise?
Sure. First, let me talk for a few seconds about Biden and his being, addressing himself very much to American workers after his initial introduction about Ukraine. I think, Biden sees that the Democratic Party has often been criticized for ignoring the concerns of average workers, of blue collar workers. He sees that many blue collar workers who used to be, part of the FDR Democratic coalition have been backing Republicans. So so in a lot of the speech, he shows that we care about American workers. We want to raise the minimum wage to $15. We want to reduce the cost of health insurance. We want to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. As Julie said, we want to make childcare more affordable. He talked about all they're doing to bring back manufacturing jobs. He boasted big time about Intel's $20 billion investment in semiconductors in Ohio, an important swing state. And so, it was in ways he was being somewhat performative because some of this will be hard to enact. He really does hope to enact some of these important measures on, improving childcare. Maybe he can get enough Republicans to back a higher minimum wage, but for instance, to enact the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, that would be a heavy lift to get enough Republicans aboard to overcome a filibuster. So I think a lot of workers across the nation, seeing that Washington isn't doing nearly enough to raise the minimum wage or to do enough to fight income inequality or to do enough to about huge corporate profits while wages have stagnated for many years, they are taking steps on their own to unionize, to protest, whether it's Amazon workers trying to unionize in Bessemer, Alabama, or Staten Island here in New York, or as Starbucks workers now are trying to unionize in over 100 stores, and today there's a vote count on whether workers at the REI in Manhattan will vote to unionize. So there's a lot of ferment now among workers, especially among young workers, that things aren't good enough for us. There are too many imbalances in the American economy. So we are going to engage in self-help by unionizing, by protesting, by pushing for a $15 minimum wage to try to change things and improve things, not just for ourselves, but for blue collar workers, low wage workers in general.
So Andy, let me bring you into this conversation. The president was very animated when he talked about these worker issues and the Bipartisan Innovation Act, which has passed the Senate. And this act would make record investments in manufacturing, emerging technologies. And he suggested that these investments represent an investment in the field of dreams. Tell me about these proposals and what it could mean for workers, especially in manufacturing, and especially with respect to inclusive hiring in manufacturing.
So the president really has embraced blue collar issues like manufacturing and infrastructure. Talked about repairing over 1,500 bridges. The manufacturing sector has come back strong, adding just under 400,000 factory jobs last year. One of the best years on record, and the message is to keep this momentum going. The investments in the CHIPS Act, which is part of that package, could trigger thousands of more manufacturing jobs in the semiconductor industry, as promised by the Intel CEO who was there last night. It also includes major investments in historically Black colleges and universities and community economic development approaches that would make sure that technology development is not only concentrated, in the coasts and among white engineers, that it's a more diverse field. But I like, what Julie said. I wanted to emphasize that, I feel like we have a lot of work to do. It's just as important for our competitiveness to have a strong caregiving economy, if not more so than physical infrastructure, when it ensures that our economy remains competitive. Inflation is such a hard issue, and it, is serious, for every voter. But improving supply chains, that's one reason prices are so high now, because their supply chains, aren't flexible. Addressing childcare, these are things and they're messages that can say that we're serious about reducing the acute inflation Americans are experiencing. And I just encourage us to talk together, about these issues. We've come so far. The president was right to say we created more jobs in 1 year than ever before in the history of the United States. We went from 1 million workers per year being laid off, per week being laid off, to 200,000. And it's just a tremendous recovery. And I was really happy they also kind of, reminded voters that we recovered so much more quickly than we did after the financial crisis.
Stephen, when you think about things that the president can do besides the two legislative proposals to help workers, what comes to mind? Things that you think he could take either administrative action on or things that he could win legislatively? What more can the president do?
So there are a lot of think tanks, unions are saying he should move more aggressively on executive orders. You know, for instance, he has issued an executive order requiring federal contractors to pay at least $15 an hour. He could rearrange how federal contracts are awarded to give preference to companies that don't fight unions or that ensure more diversity or ensure more benefits like paid family leave. I know a lot of people would also like, you know, Biden has been quite pro-union. They'd like to see him take further steps, like go to a Starbucks, go to Bessemer, Alabama, and really say, you know, unions are important. They're important for building a middle class. They're important for reducing income inequality. They're important for giving workers a bigger voice and countering corporate power. And they really want to see Biden take that extra step to really formally back some unionization drives. That might anger corporate America, but it would certainly make many workers and unions extremely enthusiastic about him. And I think it would be an important step to help address the huge income inequality in the United States.
Thank you. Andy, I want to go back to you on manufacturing. The Century Foundation and you in particular and your colleagues have been working on making manufacturing more inclusive. And there's a whole network of local economic development agencies and community colleges who are taking this seriously. Can you talk a little bit about, as the president develops his plans, strategies that can be used to make sure that when we invest in manufacturing, that everybody can share in the high wage jobs that it can produce?
And I think this administration is serious about that. 2/3 of workers in manufacturing are white. 70% of workers in manufacturing are men. And this is an industry that's facing a crisis. There's more job openings in manufacturing last year than ever. So it's a sector that has to recruit in a more inclusive manner. And so we put forward, what we call impactful credentialing, both get people a credential, the high skills they needed. It's not like it used to be. You could just walk onto a factory floor with a high school degree and you could operate the machines, but also really work with community-based organizations, with companies to create more inclusive workforces, eradicating things like sexual harassment, in the workplace. And I think this administration is committed to that work. The Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor and their activities they're doing. They're not waiting for Congress, but more funding for programs like the regional technology hubs, passed would go a long way to fulfilling these ideas.
Thank you. I want to go over to Jamila and get Jamila. I want to get your take on the things the president talked about in terms of healthcare. He talked about COVID and being prepared if there are new variants. He talked about extending more premium assistance under the Affordable Care Act. You and I talked about this beautiful moment where 13-year-old Joshua, a young man who has type 1 diabetes, was in the audience, and the struggle that his family has in paying for insulin, which is, the president said, substantially more expensive in the United States than it is in other places. Your comments?
Yeah, I thought what the president did last night was really, be clear with the American people that he's still fighting to make sure that healthcare is more affordable and accessible in this country, pulling out some of the things you mentioned, Mark, in terms of reducing prescription drug costs, putting a spotlight on those related to insulin, also setting forth, again, a theme for the conversation today, restating his priorities that were part of the Build Back Better Act, including making the premium subsidies permanent, talking about filling the coverage gap in this country. I think another important piece of the conversation was the fact that he brought reproductive rights and justice into his speech last night. That is not something that we typically see from presidents during their State of the Union addresses. So President Biden mentioned, protecting the right to choose in this country, the fact that Roe versus Wade is on the line right now through cases that are going to be coming up through the Supreme Court, I think is key. And then he also mentioned the importance of advancing maternal health. Right now, Black women are 3 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related causes when compared to white women. And then in the past year, we just saw that among Hispanic women, that the maternal mortality rate actually increased 44% in 1 year. So again, really important points made there. I think another thing I'll add, as some constructive criticism for the president, I might add, is the fact that he didn't use the word abortion. And I think that is really key in the context of conversations around reproductive rights and justice, because when we aren't explicit about using that word, it helps to further stigmatize abortion. And for the millions of people in this country who have had abortions and will have them, it would have been important for them to hear him say those words last night.
And Jamila, you've been working on the Momnibus, which is a multifaceted legislative strategy to address the issue of maternal health. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that and what you've been doing to advance that legislation?
Sure, absolutely. So the Black Maternal Health Momnibus Act is legislation supported by Representative Lauren Underwood, Alma Adams, and Senator Cory Booker. It's a package of 12 bills that focus on addressing almost every dimension of the Black maternal health crisis in this country. And our team at TCF has really been working to advance that legislation, both in this iteration, it was reintroduced in 2021, as well as the last iteration of the bill. I will say that one of the greatest accomplishments that we've had this year is the fact that about 9 aspects or provisions, investments, or so I should say, that are included in the Black Maternal Health Omnibus were a part of the Build Back Better Act. And so we continue to push forth to make sure that those investments are actually passed and signed into law. And I think it's no better time than now to make sure that particularly Black women and other women of color in this country have the health care they need to address the maternal health crisis in this country.
Thank you. Emma, I want to bring you into this conversation. As you know, President Biden has not rhetorically made education the centerpiece of his agenda, but in fact, he's delivered very serious aid to the schools over the last year. And he also called for increasing support for historically Black colleges and universities and increasing Pell Grants. Can you evaluate his remarks from the State of the Union with respect to education and what you think the next steps are?
Yeah, thank you. So as you previewed, and I sort of previewed before, I think there's a lot of good stuff. The president has done a lot to deliver aid to schools in terms of COVID recovery aid. Over the last few years, we've seen $160 billion go to K-12 and higher ed systems, which are really unheard of and substantial investments. As I mentioned, really glad for him to lead with the call for schools to remain open. I think that's where we need to be, particularly for kids in communities who have been hardest hit by COVID, hardest hit by both academic and mental health needs that we have a collective responsibility to try and support. I think along those lines, I would say sort of when I think big picture about the president's record on education, probably the single most important thing that could have been done and was done for kids post-COVID is around vaccines and testing, which are what allow our schools to reopen safely, safe for kids, safe for educators. Those have not been perfect rollouts, particularly from an equity perspective, but they've been done, they've been substantial, and they have allowed schools to reopen. So would not want to understate the importance of that for kids and for education. As you flagged, there's some good investments that got a passing mention there. I mean, Julie already talked about this, but the president's ongoing persistence and commitment to expanding high quality pre-K, something that we prioritized and worked on in the Obama administration, that many of us worked on Capitol Hill, is so welcome and is one of the biggest game changers we could do for kids. And so really grateful to see that. As you mentioned, increasing Title I funding for schools that serve low-income kids, increasing funding for students with disabilities, additional funding for students' mental health, where he sort of laid out a plethora of different ideas. Was nice to see. Increasing funding for Pell, our most dedicated form of funding for low-income college students. Loved the mention of increased investments in not just HBCUs, but also tribal colleges and minority serving institutions broadly. They have been underinvested in for decades, and it's really good to see how much the administration is prioritizing that. And along those lines, our colleague Denise Smith is not here, but if y'all don't know her, she's done some amazing writing and research on the impact and needs of HBCUs that are really worth taking a look at. The flip side is that's a lot of money, and we've seen a lot of money go into the system already. And what we didn't hear a lot about is any sort of national leadership or national plan to actually help students recover. You know, America's kids and students are objectively in crisis. If you look at the data, we have 1 million fewer kids enrolled in college than we would have expected to see pre-COVID, right? That's huge, and that's disproportionately hitting young people of color and low-income young people. They're just not going. They're just not staying. We have students, younger students, all kinds of mixed data, but are probably at least 4 to 5 months behind where they ought to be in terms of basic reading and math skills, probably substantially more, again, for students of color, low-income students. The president can't flip that. I have all people understand the limits of the federal role in education, but to not speak to that and not use your national leadership to have a national plan, I think is really troubling in terms of what it really means in terms of the priorities we're setting out for our kids.
Let me ask you, Emma, one of the things that I don't think the president touched on that was very much an issue during the campaign was student debt and debt cancellation. Obviously, an increase in Pell is helpful, but not a solution to students that owe an average of $35,000 or more in student loans. Some owe considerably more from that. Why don't you think the president mentioned student debt? And what do you think is the next step on that issue?
I think the absence of a mention of student debt was certainly notable. And I know a lot of students, student advocates, families, working Americans were certainly looking for that and hoping for that. I think the president has been clear. He's looking at options there, but he's also just thinking about looking forward. What are the forward-looking ways in terms of increasing Pell, in terms of free college, to actually tackle student debt issues in a sustainable way going forward for our highest need students and students of color? And I think and hope we will continue to see more aggressive action from the administration there, both from an executive action perspective and in terms of the legislative agenda and the budget they roll out in a few weeks.
Good, thank you. So Danny, there's some big plans afoot for the Biden administration. Tell us, your take on what has the possibility of making it through and what's going to be the bigger challenges and why.
Well, it's a great question. And as my fellow panelists are describing, there are enormous number of challenges facing the country. And as I said earlier, I thought the president's goal was in part to convey to the country what he believes in, what he cares about, not necessarily what he thought was going to be able to get done. But he entered the speech at 37% favorable ratings in the most recent Washington Post poll. And that's obviously a very deep hole to climb out of in an election year. So he really wanted to communicate with American people. He left a few things out, as my colleagues here today have said, left a few things out that people really care about. And he was speaking in and to a legislative body, Mark, as you're saying. So the question for the Congress and for the president is, what will they work together on? What do they agree that is important to the American people? And what is a must do? There are a few, in my opinion, there are a couple of overriding challenges that are deeply concerning to me and I think to most people. One is the fate of our democracy. And he essentially spoke to that in his language around Ukraine by suggesting that democracy was going to triumph. But the fate of our democracy after January 6th, the January 6th insurrection, and the changes to voting laws across the country that the president spoke to last night, very significant. Climate is an existential threat to the world, certainly to the United States, and a very difficult challenge politically to make headway on, but he spoke to it last night. And then, of course, COVID, he wanted to convey that, we didn't meet together a year ago, and this year we are meeting together, and that was his way of saying that we've made very significant stride on the COVID pandemic, but there's obviously more to be done there. There are a few things that I think are going to get addressed. The manufacturing bill, the competes USICA legislation, there's going to be a serious effort to do that. The Senate has a bipartisan version of it, and the House has a Democratic only version of it, which is going to create a heavy lift to negotiate, but I do think that's a priority. There's an issue that's been kind of a sleeper issue publicly, but not inside Congress, which is getting heard on the floor of the House this week, and will also be heard in the Senate, which is to provide better health care to veterans who were exposed to toxins in the course of serving in the military. And the president spoke to that quite strongly last night. It's a very expensive piece of legislation in the House. It's more than $280 billion, but it's got a lot of support. And I think there's going to be a serious effort. The speaker listed that as one of her goals for completing this year when she put out her agenda earlier this year. The only other thing that really has to get done, of course, is keeping the government open. And, you know, that used to be not such a hard thing to do, but for the last 10 or more years with the hyperpartisanship in Washington, meeting your deadlines on appropriations and budget bills has become a very difficult thing. So the next deadline is March 11th, and the appropriations bill has to be finished or get extended somehow, or the government will shut down. And then you'll go into October, and you'll have to do that all over again. So between now and the end of the year, you have a couple of budget showdowns. Other than that, unfortunately, the Congress doesn't need to do anything if it doesn't want to reach an agreement. So the future of Build Back Better will depend on this reframing, Mark, that you talked about at the outset, the reset. The reframing is, let's do a couple of really big things that the country needs. Is it going to be childcare? Is it going to be pre-K? Is it going to be more paid leave, more healthcare? It looks like it's certainly going to have something to do with climate, plus a few other things, not as much as what the president originally said, and it will contribute to deficit reduction. But that's not a must pass, that's a wanna pass, and the president has a lot of work to do to cajole the Congress to work with him on that.
Let me ask you, one of the audience members has asked specifically about Manchin and Sinema, and in the context of childcare and pre-K, and I'll bring Julie into this too, Danny. Tell us what the process is going to be for bringing Manchin and Sinema back into the discussions on some of these, what were Build Back Better priorities. How does that happen? What's, from the insider's perspective, how does that get done?
Well, I'm happy to defer to Julie on the specifics, but I think that the deficit reduction element of this is going to be key for someone like Manchin, to give him the opportunity to say, I'm not just voting for a bill that spends a lot of money, I'm voting for a bill that is responsible, that sets America on a good economic course. He's not necessarily opposed to all of these different elements. He's probably opposed to having all of them together. And he comes from an extremely conservative state that overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump, and he's trying to read the tea leaves in his own state, and he has his own point of view. But I think this resetting of what are attainable goals and what is going to look like it addresses the current conversation, which, Mark, you said, it's about higher costs for most Americans. So can Manchin be brought into that conversation? Sinema is a different kettle of fish, and some of her objections don't really have to do so much with, childcare and pre-K as they do with other aspects. So you have to take each of them separately. But Julie, I'd be happy to defer to you.
Absolutely. I think Senator Sinema understands very clearly how the lack of childcare is impacting women being able to work in Arizona, as well as, dads and grandparents and others who are impacted by that. And, we also know that Governor Manchin was the one who led the effort to have universal pre-K in West Virginia. And so childcare and pre-K issues are very popular. They happen to be very popular among Democrats and Republicans, and have long been issues that have been able to get support from both sides of the aisle, or at least from voters of both parties. We know that the provisions that President Biden has proposed would save families about $5,000 a year on childcare in both Arizona and in West Virginia. That's a pretty big deal, especially when we're trying to make sure that we're building up support systems for children and making sure they are well cared for and well set up to, be the citizenry of the future. And so I think that this is really important. I think the other thing is, if you think about the themes that President Biden brought up last night, care jobs can't be outsourced, right? These are jobs that are American jobs here to stay. And so investing in those jobs not only helps to make sure that we are investing in this country, but it also, we know that care work is the work that makes all other work possible. If we don't invest in care jobs, that is going to keep many people out of the workforce. It's going to keep them from working as much. And it's going to make the quality of their jobs and their ability to get ahead in work much, much harder. In fact, childcare disruptions impact business as well. And we know that small business leaders especially are out there talking about how much they need this federal government investment in childcare, because they're seeing, kids on the Zoom calls all throughout the pandemic, and they understand just how important it is that we invest in this system so that businesses can thrive, so that families can thrive, so that children can thrive. And so I think this is essential, and that it is going to get the support it needs to move forward.
Thank you. Thanasi, there's some questions coming in about Ukraine, which don't surprise me. One of them is asking, is the focus on defending NATO, making it clear to Russia and everyone else that we're really, in the end, not going to give Ukraine the kind of support that it needs? And I think what's implied there is eventually military support. For people who don't follow this every day, explain why a NATO country may get, or would likely get, military support from the United States, but a non-NATO country, even though it may be a close ally, like Ukraine is, will not get that kind of military support. How do lay people come to understand how the government differentiates between those situations?
So just a couple of quick, really important points. One is NATO is our only military treaty alliance. We are, and all NATO members, obligated by treaty to come to the defense of another NATO country when it's attacked, if it asks. So there is a step where a country in NATO can be attacked and not ask for help, and we don't have to go to defend it. People have been very lax and careless, not the president last night, but people out in the public sphere, at calling for the US to somehow get directly involved in the fight in the Ukraine. And it's really important to throw some cold water on this. Russia is a bellicose nuclear power. It's a massive, major power. We spent an entire Cold War avoiding direct entanglement with the Soviet Union, now Russia. We do not want a nuclear war. This is not this is not a containable small regional conflict like the wars people have gotten used to since the end of the Cold War. So I've heard crazy calls for a no-fly zone over the Ukraine, or for the United States to get directly involved in arming the Ukrainians. We saw European countries sending weapons to Ukraine, which, by the way, is dangerous. This is the kind of thing that can cause a direct war with Russia. And for a minute, some of these NATO partners of the US were talking about sending fighter planes to the Ukraine. And that stopped. That was over the weekend. And I think there was some quick thinking, and they realized that is direct war with Russia. And if NATO partners send fighter jets to the Ukraine, what's to stop Russia from attacking Europe? At which point we are in a World War III scenario. That is why this is so dangerous. So the president was very careful. He put down this line: we will defend our NATO allies. And that too, by the way, carries a huge risk. We heard the president say we're going to send American resources to the Baltic republics, to Poland. These are countries on Russia's border. That is the right thing to do. It carries a tremendous danger of escalation, because Putin will see this, correctly so, as a check on his ambitions. And we're doing this knowing full well that there's a danger that the next response is a Russian escalation. And so we must not be casual or glib about this. The price will be huge for the whole world. We're willing to take that risk because we can't have a madman controlling a nuclear armed country and invading sovereign countries. But the Ukraine, this is the last thing I'll say, sadly, if Putin wants to destroy the Ukraine, we cannot and will not directly intervene to stop him from doing so. And that's kind of the tragedy of great power politics.
Thank you, Thanasi. So we got a question on the Buy America provisions that the president talked about, and suggesting that this, if done right, is sort of the answer to globalization that has, undermined manufacturing in the country for many years. And the questioner wants to know if we could comment on that, and I'll let the economic team jump in with anything they want on the Buy American provisions that the president talked about.
The president mentioned that we've had the Buy America Act since the Second World War, but the loopholes in it are so big you could drive a semi, right through them, from a port with Chinese goods, to infrastructure jobs. So this administration appointed Celeste Drake, a labor union top official, to run a new Buy America office. And under her leadership, there's going to be an effort to tighten, those loopholes and to invest in the supply chains. A lot of supplies that the government needs, we don't even make in America. So you have to close the loopholes, and you have to do what he's doing, which is to reinvest in our supply chains. I think it's a major move. It's underappreciated, the impact, that public procurement could do to support manufacturing and union jobs if done in the right way. That, procurement, like on a rail car or trains, to make sure that it's union built, wherever it's built.
Thank you. Emma, one thing that the president didn't talk a lot about was climate change, which, was a little bit surprising. They didn't give more emphasis, but, it was a long speech as it was, but I'm a little bit surprised. But one of the things that you've been looking at is the Conservation Corps and volunteerism, and a new generation of Americans getting excited about volunteering and working in areas like conservation and climate and others. Could you say a little bit about some of the legislation that's moving through on this, and the special emphasis that it's giving to have an inclusive group of the next generation of volunteers working in service to America?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the Climate Corps program, which has been a big and substantial part of the Build Back Better Act, and which, as Danny mentioned, it seems hopeful there will be some climate components that will stay in as that moves forward. We're very hopeful this will be one of the components that stays in, basically working to help young people take on jobs, to all types of different jobs, working with nonprofits and government to address climate change in different ways. It is modeled in some ways after AmeriCorps, an existing program, but sort of some of the most critical components of the Climate Corps, which are in the legislation, which we are very excited to see, frankly, is having a far deeper focus on equity, inclusion, and workforce development. So moving this from a program that allows young people to drop into a community, do a nice thing for a year, often have a real impact. There's real upside to a lot of these programs, but then move on to their real life job, to a program that is really aiming to recruit and support people from communities, people from low income communities, people of color, pay them a livable wage, unlike what's generally currently paid in these programs, opening pathways up to a far larger set of young people, and then give them some of the skills they need to move into existing career pathways and high growth energy and climate pathways. So really excited about the shape of the legislation, very hopeful about it moving forward in whatever legislative package we see. Did not hear a lot about it last night, though. That is fair.
All right, panel, we're out of time. You were the dream team that I expected you would be. This was a great discussion. And for those of you watching, please go to tcf.org, sign up for our newsletter so you can get the analysis and content and research that we're working on education issues, on healthcare issues and jobs. Thanks again, panel, and thank you, audience, for listening. See you next time.